Good morning.
Will
all the stragglers please get their cup of coffee and take their seats? We've got a great presentation and program for you this morning. Today, this session is entitled Catholic Feminism and the Culture of Death. And what we have to give you today is three presentations by three women who are Catholics, feminists, and academics, each representing their own take and their own discipline in coming together to examine this common, complicated problem. Our first speaker this morning will be Helen Alvare, who is currently an associate professor of law at the Columbus School of Law at the Catholic University of America. Prior to this position, she was the Director of Planning and Information for Pro-Life Activities for the United States Catholic Conference. Our second speaker this morning will be Margaret Monahan Hogan, who's an associate professor at King's College in the philosophy department, who has written widely on areas of ethics and particularly medical ethics. Our final speaker this morning will be Professor Maura Ryan, who is an associate professor in the theology department and who specializes in moral theology and particularly not only medical ethics, but some of the new reproductive technologies that you see talked about, it seems, in every issue of the New York Times. So each of these three speakers will make their presentation, and then we will have a discussion among both the panel members and the wider audience. So, Professor Alvare.
Good morning. I still have to suppress a giggle every time someone says professor to me. I'll get used to that in about 6 years, I guess. It's a pleasure to see you again on this lightly named topic, Christian feminism and the culture of death. I remember when that first became popularly used, my husband said, you know, you're going to have to go over to Rome and work in the PR department over there because they got to come up with something a little bit more appealing to talk about than the culture of death. However, there is a lot to it, a lot that it's interesting. And the question that I want to address this morning for 10 or 15 minutes is whether there should be a role specifically for women, specifically Christian women, in the struggle against a culture of death. Frankly, my answer comes from a number of years of very practical experience in this arena, and I think the answer is very clearly yes, that there's not simply a role for all Christians. There's very specifically some roles that Christian women can do particularly well. A first role that I think Christian women can play uniquely well is to restore a good name, in fact, a holy name, to the notion of service. You may recall in the 1960s and 70s that the women's movement of that time in particular got a lot of rhetorical power out of decrying the role that women were playing in the home and really in marriage and in families as mothers and as wives very generally. They made fun of the domestic chores, cooking, cleaning, shopping, portrayed women as, you know, dray horses during manual labor in the care of children and families. Any care that benefited the husband was looked on with some disdain. They saw this work as unappreciated, physical, not mental, generally beneath women, and had the effect of rendering people's understanding of women as per se lesser than men. This critique expanded outside of women's role in marriage and family and had the effect, I think, of generally demeaning service, not only in the home, but as a way of life or service occupations in general. Service occupations that women traditionally disproportionately worked in were where women were told these are not occupations that you should focus on, ones like nursing, teaching, secretarial work, and so forth. Women were encouraged to think about jobs held traditionally by men as superior jobs. I often think of Pat Ireland, who as I've debated her a number of times on television, and she's very charming in television appearances. You know, she's the head of a national organization of women, and I had to try and suppress a laugh because I didn't want to agree with her when she would describe her former career as a flight attendant as one in which she, quote, accepted people's trash and said thank you for it, unquote. I see this as sort of a summary of the demeaning of the service roles that women have disproportionately engaged in. So again, women were encouraged to do the work that men do, which is perceived as delegating, delegating the harder work to others. It gave the idea of service a bad name in a very general way. But of course, Christian teaching, and you see this summarized particularly in Evangelium Vitae and in the papal encyclical Mulieris Dignitatem, speaks of the very heart of the Christian vocation as being the man or woman for others, as being at the heart of conforming oneself to Christ, as being at the heart of the practice of Christian love, and that separating oneself from this understanding of who we are as deathly to us, as separating oneself from the life and nurture of Jesus Christ. Christianity also teaches that an integral part of being in God's image and likeness is being in relationship, just as God is always in relationship in the Trinity, that we too are meant to be as humans in God's image and likeness, in relationship, in community, which necessarily implicates mutual service, interdependence, complementarity. I therefore believe that Christian women could play a special part in restoring a good name to the labor that is involved in care for others without its demeaning aspects, that Christianity has the resources for restoring the idea of community with men, not subjugation in that community, complementarity, relationship without inequality. Now, I think that's tricky today because of the dominance of the choice ethic, as in, so long as you freely choose X, X is legitimate for you, but nothing further is proved about X than that it is legitimate for you. A woman's choice today to spend herself full-time on her family or to spend herself both on career outside the home and children, either way is considered a sacred cow that is not permitted to be commented upon in, normative commentary in public. And so everything is simply your choice and it is good for you. Therefore, Christian women are going to have to, I think, articulate the larger truth about finding Christ and finding one's true self in the gift of self for others, no matter how one chooses to give that gift, but to take it beyond simply the language of my choice into my choice to serve as a good choice on itself. Second special role that I think women can play in the struggle against the culture of death, Christian women can play, is with respect to an issue that perhaps more than any other has led to the conclusion that the culture of death is among us, that is the issue of abortion. While abortion is not supported by the majority of women, in particular not by the majority of mothers, abortion still derives its greatest support demographically from non-Hispanic, white, educated males over 35. That's the single strongest cohort of support for abortion. When women are surveyed from the 60s to the present, they still demonstrate lesser support for abortion and more understanding of the humanity of the child in the womb at an earlier point. So abortion has not been spearheaded as a movement primarily by women. However, it is widely understood as a subject on which women possess special competence. When a man stands up to speak, he has not only the hurdle of overcoming presuppositions that his audience may have about abortion in favor of abortion, but he also has the hurdle of overcoming his maleness. A woman either gets an advantage for being female and speaking about it, or at least neutralizes that factor when she gets up and speaks. I think a current topic on which women ought to be speaking, and which will be very fruitful in the area of abortion and is of particular female competence is the question of post-abortion distress. I've spent the last year and a half before I left the Bishops' Conference working on this topic, and I had a chance to review perhaps 100 articles from medical journals around the world on this subject. And in fact, I did it was absolutely months and months in the making because the evidence was so, researchers were looking for so many different things. But I did do a summary of the state of the evidence on this that's on the website that we have, hopeafterabortion.com. And what one sees in the best studies, the record-based studies in particular, in countries like Denmark and Finland, where every woman's medical history has been kept from birth to the present time, and so there is not a self-selection bias in the studies that have been done regarding women who experience distress after abortion. What one is seeing from these record-based studies is that women who have abortions have sometimes 3 to 6 times the rate of suicide of women who either do not have children or women who were pregnant and brought the child to term. They have twice the rate of psychiatric admissions of women who gave birth to children. Even in the U.S., which has no record-based studies yet, Brenda Major at UCLA, who is a very avid proponent of legal abortion, has written a body of work, along with some other researchers, that indicate that there are a number of risk factors for a woman's likelihood to experience post-abortion distress. The interesting thing is that those who support abortion take great consolation from the fact that these risk factors do not seem, or that not more than 50% of women report post-abortion distress in any of these studies. The problem is that the risk factors are indicating that you have still a huge percentage of women, perhaps close to 50%, who have what even the most strongly supportive, those most strongly supportive of legal abortion would say are huge risk factors for experiencing post-abortion distress. Things like having had more than one abortion. Well, I mean, almost 50% of all abortions are repeats now. It's up to 49% of all abortions are a woman's second, third, fourth, or more. Youth. Having a difficult personal situation that leads you to have the abortion. Well, there's a tremendous number of abortions that fall into that category. Abortion of a child with a disability, which is reported by about 7% of women having abortions, even though the majority of those do not say they had any disability confirmed in the child. They suspected one or feared that they did something early in the pregnancy which might have caused one. But anyway, you add up these risk factors, and that's a lot of women at risk. And considering we still have 1.3 million abortions a year, that's a lot of women at risk. There is a very particular place for women to stand up and speak effectively about an issue that is perceived to be a woman's issue, and that does indeed, on the ground, have some of its most serious psychological consequences for women who, especially those who undergo abortion. Finally, a role that I think Christian women can play is bridging the political divide that currently exists between those authentically entitled women's issues and opposition to death-dealing measures like abortion, euthanasia, assisted suicide. You may have noticed just the way our political parties have evolved, that those who are the most vocal regarding women's needs for better child care services, better health care, better job opportunities, also seem to be the same politicians who are most strongly supportive of abortion, right up through and including partial birth abortion. A Christian feminist can bridge this without taking an extra breath. It is who we are as Christian feminists to be concerned about not only the sacredness of human life, but the dignity of life from beginning to end. We see some of the most serious consequences of this, not only here in the United States, where women in some of the most difficult social and economic circumstances are spoken to by politicians who link abortion with a pro-woman agenda in such a way that disadvantaged populations, particularly the poor, feel that they have no choice but to accept both of these agendas together. And that women who come in with the feminist agenda have a credibility when they speak about the need for abortion. We see this also abroad. Catholics for a Free Choice is particularly active in South America. They get a lot of funding from the MacArthur Foundation and other foundations to go there, and they come in with an anti-macho, feminist, anti-spousal abuse, and so forth agenda and bring abortion with it. Their credibility is dramatically enhanced. We also see it in the context of United Nations conferences which attempt to deal with population and development and women's issues. Massive programs of government-sponsored birth control that is handed out in something approaching or often is outright a coercive manner, are tied with a feminist agenda, feminist rhetoric. And it's terribly destructive. Not only is it not what is going to solve the population and development issues that are going on in that country, but women are bearing the worst burdens of being coerced to use certain forms of birth control, coerced to be sterilized, coerced to have abortions. I think that the Church, the Catholic woman in particular, is in a uniquely advantageous position to address this. The Holy See's activities, particularly at the UN conferences in Beijing and Cairo, show us that there's another way. The Catholic programs on the ground, the kind that forgiveness discussion, we have tremendous programs on the ground with a unique amount of contact with citizens, Catholic Relief Services in particular. We have an excellent idea about what women and families in these countries really require to overcome pressures that may be created by a lack of resources for the number of people that are there. Better information and more goodwill than is often had by the international diplomats who go to these UN conferences, who are often taken from the most elite top percentage of society. Marianne Glendon delivered a paper at the Holy See's conference in Rio on the family, where she did a brilliant description of the international diplomats who take ideas that would absolutely never fly in their own countries about what should be done with and to the poor, and take them to these international conferences. And then the group of elite representatives from these dramatically poor countries together agrees how the poor should be handled at these international fora, and then attempt to carry that out as an international mandate locally after the conferences are over. What the Holy See did was, not only from our teaching, but also from our vast experience on the ground in these poorest countries, propose what women and families really need, which is a combination of some of the most basic goods: education, health care, clean water, help with their maternity, not simply in avoiding it. And one finds from the best economic studies, the best studies done by the international economists, Amartya Sen has written beautifully on this, that in countries where development is really attended to, particularly through attention to women's basic needs and basic equality, the pressure between population size and available resources does diminish. That pressure diminishes. The countries actually do experience development. I think that the Christian woman is in a uniquely good position to bridge the political gap, both domestically and internationally, between those who support feminism, but at the same time propose death as a solution to some of the problems that women are experiencing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helen. As we got together right before this, we hoped that we were not going to overlap. We did first get together just before this. Now, if we understand culture to be a pattern of behavior transmitted by social means, and if we understand culture as a strong and powerful influence on behavior, We have much to fear in a culture that so often chooses killing human beings as the solution to human problems. So I'm picking up on the theme that Helen just ended with. Today I'd like to address just one in the long list of choices of death over life, and that issue is abortion. I'd like to talk a little bit about my puzzlement in regard to abortion, and then I'd like to talk just a little bit about the genesis of culture, and then I'd like to talk a little bit about a corrected version of feminism, all in the 15 to 20 minutes that I've been allotted. Now, don't think for a moment that I'm not acutely aware of the pain and suffering involved in the other issues, and also don't think that I've spent my life in single-minded opposition to abortion, although I have spent considerable energies there. I've spent 20 years working with men in maximum security prison in Green Bay, Wisconsin also. But abortion has been a pressing issue in my entire adult life. Sidney Callahan and I can both attest to this, that abortion has paralleled our whole academic and professional lives. We can match with Helen stories of the debates and the imbalance of the debates and the 15-to-1 odds over the years that the debates have been supposedly fairly presented in the United States. As a graduate student in New York City, the abortion juggernaut erupted fiercely onto the political scene and sped quickly, without thought, through the state legislature. And as a young woman, I took part in the debates in the early 60s and in the early 70s. And I watched the early victories of the pro-abortion coalition. And then I saw a tidal change. I saw a tidal change as to the question, choose what? Another question was addressed. It was the question, what are you choosing? What are you choosing? What is this claimed right to choose? The identification of the what as the choice of death was the catalyst for a brief reversal in the early 70s, 71, 72, that was negated by the January 1973 decisions of the United States Supreme Court. Now, from the beginning of the abortion controversy, I was struck, and I continue to be struck, by the particular horror that a woman would destroy a new life developing within her body, that spouses, boyfriends, and parents would be accomplices and sometimes instigators in such deeds, and that the learned professions of law and medicine and the academy would fashion arguments, procedures, and statutes to accomplish and facilitate what heretofore had been an unspeakable horror. For ours was a generation that learned, that studied, that read, that heard the history of other horrors of wanton destruction of human life. If abortion destroys a developing human life, and there is ample evidence that it does so, then the cumulative number of abortions in the United States is both perplexing and problematic. It is problematic because at the rate of more than 1 million a year for almost 30 years, more than 30 million, the numbers are fast outdistancing the killing wrought by the totalitarian regimes of the last century. However, to speak about numbers is to leave the discussion on an abstract and detached level. For the numbers, when we speak of abortion, represent deaths of vulnerable, dependent human beings, professionally, medically killed by the choices of the women who carry them within their bodies. Recently, my puzzlement in this regard was dissipated somewhat. I heard a lecture by Todorov right here at Notre Dame, who developed the theme of the intellectual foundations of totalitarianism. At first I was startled, and then I was intrigued by the notion that there was such a thing as an intellectual foundation for such a horrible set of occurrences. I had always thought, rather naively perhaps, that the combination of power and will supplied the sufficient account for such horror in such a short amount of time. Now, I don't want to deny for a moment that the pursuit of power and evil had a play. If Gil Mylander were here instead of in another room, he would be reminding us of that. Nonetheless, Todorov's lecture allowed me to see the particular power of a particular constellation of ideas that form a particular culture and the consequences of the unleashing of that power. It occurred to me as I thought about Todorov's lecture that what he was talking about was culture as a particular surround, which delineated the horizon within which people live and work and think and make choices. While the culture he described was the product of many decades of human making, it had become a powerful force in human shaping, a law to direct choices, action, and development. Now, we tend to think of culture and development of culture as progress. We tend not to think of it as decline. But if we understand culture as developing in accord with emergent probability, a theme developed by Bernard Lonergan in his seminal work, Insight, we can begin to understand the possibility of decline as well as the possibility of progress. Culture is the product of world process in which the design is emergent probability. Emergent probability results from the combination of condition schemes and their respective probabilities of emergence and survival. It is the explanatory notion that supplies the adequate account of a dynamic process within which classical laws operate, within which statistical laws operate, and within which human beings operate. As a human product, and I think this is very important to remember, that culture is a human product. The generation of culture is a function of the underlying manifold, that is, advances in technology, prosperity, and economic stability. Advances in the underlying manifold, however, are propelled by human intelligence. As detached and disinterested, this tends to favor progress. The advancement in culture then in turn favors human advancement in a mutual and reciprocal progression as each creates and is created by the other. Human beings then become executors of culture. They become the executors of emergent probability of human affairs. However, the pure desire to know is just one director of human action. There has to be an underlying manifold that is congenial to progress. There has to be a set of correct insights that supply the intellectual foundation. And there has to be an agent who is driven by the desire to know, to act upon the ideas, and take advantage of the underlying manifold. The present underlying manifold, so we are told, is the richest in the history of the world, at least here in the United States. Why, then, a culture of death? What I want to suggest is that the cause lies in a particular constellation of ideas and in the structure of the human agent. I'll take first that structure of the human agent and then pass on to that constellation of powerful ideas. I want to return again to Lonergan, and I want to talk about the bias that is generated by common sense. He says, in addition to the eros of intelligence, there is a bias of common sense, which operates in the individual, in the group, and in general. Bias in the individual arises as human sensitive spontaneity of the dramatic subject, operating from its particular partial development, competes with and overpowers and sometimes refuses the drive of intelligence. The consequence of the tension between intelligence and sensitive spontaneity in the individual results more often than not in the operation of the bias of egoism, in which the desires of the individual, rather than the good of the individual, control intelligent planning and decision-making. Lonergan describes this bias of egoism as the failure to pivot from the initial and preliminary motivation provided by desires and fears to the self-abnegation involved in allowing complete free play to intelligent inquiry. Group bias, and there's a great deal of that operative in our culture, has its origin in a particular social group. The ethos and interest of the group tend to favor its advancement. The more powerful the group, the more probable its advancement. If the interests in the group are not compatible with the group of another group or with the good of order, tension results. The group is susceptible to the same sort of bias as the individual. That is, the failure to raise questions and the failure to allow the emergence of insights that reveal its own adequacy or error. Development rather than forward and upward progress becomes stagnated or twisted. For progress of the social order is not automatic. The general bias of common sense results from the unevenness of human development. Biological maturation occurs much sooner and much more often than the development of intelligence and reasonableness. Lonergan maintains that the general bias of common sense combines with group bias to account for certain features of a distorted dialectic in which fruitful ideas are excluded and others suffer mutilation by compromise. The exclusion of a dominant group of ideas other than its own initiates the short cycle of decline, and the longer cycle of decline is initiated and sustained by the refusal of the drive of intelligence and the rejection of its own immanent norms. Let's shift for a minute and look now not to the subject, but to the powerful ideas that are exercising a great influence in the fashioning of our culture as a culture of death. These ideas stem from a particular form of feminism and a particular form of liberalism. In the midst of the second moment of the feminist movement of the 20th century, some feminists began to advance the claim of a right to abortion as a fundamental right, a necessary right, so that women might have absolute control of their reproductive finality and hence absolute control of their lives. The defense of the absolute right to abortion was advanced in a set of ideas. Most of us who have written and lectured and taught on this topic have identified a constellation of ideas, some of which focus on the women and some of which focus on the conceptus, the conceived but unborn human being. As a matter of fact, here is the set of claims as I received them from my upper division class of students in a Catholic school, Catholic college, most of whom had a Catholic education. Among the claims that they presented on the part of to advance the cause of abortion on the side of the woman were the right to control of her body, the necessity of autonomy and choice and the attainment of personal responsibility, the right of women to full social equality, the right of women to self-determination, and the very sounding American-sounding freedom to choose. Among the claims made in regard to the conceptus to advance the cause of abortion, where it is not fully human, it is not a person, it must await the bestowal of rights upon it by the woman within whose body it resides, and further, if it is disabled, it should be killed rather than allowed to suffer. Just as my students were getting ready to wrap up, they offered one final restriction. No man has a right to enter the discussion. The bias engendered by a liberalism that views the will of the autonomous rights-bearing individual as the central truth of human progress was most powerfully and publicly proclaimed by Justice Sandra Day O'Connor in the Casey versus Planned Parenthood decision, wherein she wrote regarding the liberty protected in the substantive due process clause of the 14th Amendment, and we heard that repeated yesterday by Helen, at the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of the meaning of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. Sheer nonsense. It is a view, though, that has its intellectual roots in Rawls and Dworkin, and in an act of raw philosophical positivism, it is quoted by them in the philosopher's brief, presented as an amicus curiae brief to the United States Supreme Court as it considered the issue of physician-assisted suicide. Here the myth of the autonomous person operates where in another world and at another time the myth of the Volk was operative. What is the response of the Catholic feminist? What is the higher viewpoint from which it judges the view of the radical feminist and the views of the contemporary liberal to be biased? What is the remedy for the bias of common sense? The remedy lies in both the intellect and the heart. Sandra Schneider suggested in her 2000 Madaleva lecture that the feminism necessary for the establishment of peace and justice is to be found, and I quote, in the biblical sense of universal right relationships founded in shared creaturehood, and for Christians, participation in the salvation offered to Jesus, in Jesus, to all people. Note the first, right relationships and shared creaturehood, not autonomous rights-bearing individuals. Right relationships founded in shared creaturehood. The reality is that we are dependent creatures, dependent in the most absolute and radical way for our very existence and for the continuation of that existence, first upon God and then upon each other. This realization forces us to recognize that we have our being in this world as beings in relation, related to God and related to each other. An examination of human lives as that of dependent creatures embedded in relationships suggests the following. Autonomy is always a limited accomplishment achieved over time, if at all. and achieved only after a long period of dependency and often followed by another period of dependency. Living the rich human life often places human beings in asymmetrical relationships of varying degrees throughout life. Autonomy is always limited. It is constrained by the relationships that define one's life. Relationships to others oftentimes requires the acceptance of disadvantage for the sake of others. The understanding of our lives as woven in relationships gives substance to our obligations. We exist in real relationships to one another, and from these relationships, specific duties, concrete duties, arise and are defined. These relationships limit and structure the activity of willing. It is our existence as related beings which is the source of community, of hospitality, of mutual respect, and of liberty as ordered. It is our being in relationship that defines the obligations of the powerful to the powerless. Now, what does participation in the salvation offered in Jesus to all people mean? There are many indicators of its meaning in the life of Jesus, in the parables of Jesus, in the friends of Jesus, women and men who accompanied him on his journey, and in the attitudes of Jesus. But there's also the explicit command found in the Gospel of Mark. Listen, Israel, the Lord our God is the one Lord, and you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Now, we repeat this passage blithely often enough, but we do not pause long enough to reflect on it and attempt to grasp its meaning. This New Testament passage commands the activities of the mind